August 1971. The basement of the psychology building at Stanford University has been converted into a fake prison. Cardboard cells, a cramped closet standing in for solitary confinement. 24 young men, screened for good mental health, split at random into two groups: prisoners and guards. The study was supposed to run 2 weeks. It was shut down after 6 days. And for 50 years, it became one of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology, taught in nearly every introductory textbook, cited in courtrooms, referenced to explain everything from war crimes to office politics. Here's the story you were probably told. Ordinary college students, with no history of cruelty, were given uniforms and absolute power over other ordinary college students. Within days, the guards became abusive. They forced prisoners into humiliating exercises, stripped them, deprived them of sleep. One prisoner, known as 8612, had a breakdown so severe on day 2 that he had to be released. Zimbardo himself, the lead researcher, got so absorbed in his role as prison superintendent that he stopped seeing it as an experiment and started seeing it as an actual prison he was running. The lesson, repeated in lecture halls for 2 generations, was simple and unsettling. It's not that some people are monsters. Put ordinary people in the wrong situation, hand them a uniform and unchecked power, and most of them will become monsters too. It's a clean story. It's a scary story. And it's the reason the Stanford prison experiment sits right next to the Milgram obedience studies as proof that evil is less about who you are and more about the situation you're dropped into. It's been used to explain Abu Ghraib, genocide, corporate misconduct, all trace back to this one basement in California. Here's what almost nobody was taught alongside it. Starting in the late 2010s, a French researcher named Thibault Letexier got access to something most people citing this study never had: the actual archives, original audio recordings, handwritten notes, unpublished interviews with the participants taken decades later. And what he found didn't just complicate the story. It undermined the central claim. The guards weren't simply ordinary people who spontaneously turned cruel under the weight of a uniform. They were coached. There's a recording of the orientation session, before the study even began, where one of Zimbardo's research team explicitly told the guards to be tough, to create a sense of powerlessness in the prisoners, to make them feel like every part of their life was controlled. This wasn't a blank slate that cruelty happened to fill in. It was a brief, and some of the guards followed it. Then there's prisoner 8612, the breakdown that anchors the entire legend of the study, the moment used again and again as proof that the simulation had become psychologically real. In interviews conducted years later, 8612, whose real name is Douglas Corpy, said something that rarely makes it into the textbook version. He said he faked it. He had an exam to study for, the researchers wouldn't let him quit voluntarily, and a breakdown was the only exit that worked. Listen to the actual audio, and it plays less like a man losing his grip on reality and more like a man performing distress loudly enough to be believed. And then there's the detail that undoes the "anyone would do this" framing entirely. Not all the guards were cruel. Later analysis of the tape suggests only about a third of them behaved abusively. Some guards were reported to have quietly done small kindnesses for prisoners when no one was watching. If the situation alone were powerful enough to turn ordinary people into abusers, you wouldn't expect a third of your sample to opt out of the abuse. You'd expect closer to all of them. None of this means the guards who did become cruel weren't genuinely capable of it, or that the discomfort in that basement wasn't real. People signed up, were told explicitly how to behave, and some leaned into it further than instructed. But that's a very different, much less viral story than ordinary people spontaneously became monsters. It's a story about instruction, performance, and a research team that wanted a dramatic result and got one partly by asking for it. So why did the clean version win for 50 years? Because it's simpler, and because Zimbardo himself spent decades promoting it. Books, documentaries, a TED Talk, expert testimony. The uncomplicated version travels. Give people power and they become cruel. Fits on a slide. A research team coached a subset of guards. One prisoner performed a breakdown to escape a boring study, and roughly a third of participants behaved as instructed does not fit on a slide, even though it's closer to what the archives actually show. There's a psychological point buried in that gap, and it might be the most useful thing this story ever taught, just not the one it was famous for. We remember and repeat the version of events that's easiest to compress into a single sentence, regardless of how much it had to leave out to get there. That's not unique to a 50-year-old psychology study. It's how rumors spread, how internet outrage spreads, how the story you tell about your own worst day gets simpler and more dramatic every time you tell it. The Stanford prison experiment is still worth knowing, just not as proof that a uniform turns anyone into a monster, as proof of something closer to